All right, so this lecture is on the Kayhara and Wellman article, Searching for Culture High and Low, which takes a look at how online culture and online information can shape the search for culture. So broadly, the overview of the article asks this big question of how do people find culture, with an emphasis on the new cultural environment that we find ourselves in. So essentially, we have access to large amounts of information online and access to culture in a way that we've never had before. And so the question becomes, how do we use that tool to find culture or amplify culture? And what is the relationship between the online world and the offline world when we're searching for culture? So we'll look at these two questions as we think through this article and the research that they conducted. So before we begin thinking about the article, it might be useful to think about what is online communication. And so online communication presents kind of a unique uh, hybrid or amalgam of various forms of communication. So when you think about how communication is discussed in other classes that you might take in the communication department at OSU, you might think about defining communication along various means. And so three big means that people, or three big methods or ways that people will separate communication is to think about interpersonal, group, and mass communication as distinct forms of communication. And so interpersonal communication is communication where you're talking to a close other, a friend, or a family member, and so it's really a discussion between individuals. And so the knowledge that's exchanged, the context in which information is exchanged is pretty well known. You engage in interpersonal communication usually with friends, family, and so you have a lot of the same contextual knowledge that the other person would have. You have history with them, you know what they're like, they know what you're like. And so this can facilitate discussion and communication, and it leads to a kind of an intimate feeling within the communication environment. So we can contrast interpersonal communication with group communication. And group communication is often distinguished in terms of what is the focus of communication? Why are people communicating in a group communication setting? And so with interpersonal communication, the communication elements are usually focused on more intimate sharing of information, catching up with the other person, or talking about something important to you. With group communication, it's usually focused on some type of task. And so you could think about group communication in reference to uh, group projects that you might have completed in classes at OSU, or in work settings. You might have a meeting where it's a group meeting and you're talking to other people that you work with. But these forms of communication are usually focused on a topic or an idea or a task that needs to get done. And so we can think about this as being pretty different from interpersonal in that interpersonal doesn't have this same type of focus, right? If I imagine if you think about like phone calls that you've had with friends or family members, they're kind of free form and they're not necessarily for a specific reason. Whereas you wouldn't typically have those types of conversations with a group member, right? The group member, you would have a more focused, isolated form of discussion and communication. And so we have group communication. We also have mass communication defined broadly as, sending messages out to a large number of individuals. And so broadcasting or mass communication, these forms of communication are typically focused on how information goes in kind of a one-directional flow from an institutional source, like a company, for example, like ABC or CBS or Disney, into a large number of people. So if we think about all three of these forms of communication, we can think about online communication as being kind of a blend of them, right? There are certain situations online where you will talk to an individual and you'll have an individual conversation and it won't necessarily be focused on a topic, right? We can think about email, we can think about chat, we can think about comments on Facebook sometimes in this kind of format. We can also think about it as kind of a group form of communication, which again, like comments on Facebook are a form of this, where you have a really focused discussion about a topic, maybe an article you shared or a picture you posted. And then we also have mass communication elements here where you might just upload something for anyone to see. So when you're tweeting on Twitter, right? When you send a tweet out, it's not a interpersonal message. It's not even really a group message. A lot of times you're just saying something that's interesting and you want a lot of people to hear it. And so it's a form of like one directional mass communication flow. And so the online environment that we have is very broad, and it is not a single form of communication that can really describe it, but it becomes important to really think about it in these various contexts of interpersonal, group, and then mass communication. So if we think about the online world, what we're really thinking about in terms of popular culture is that it's provides us with access to all sorts of information. You get, you know, access basically to things that are produced by major motion picture companies or major broadcasters or major communication conglomerates. So these are things like if you're watching TV series online or streaming a TV series. But you also have the ability for um, content produced by individuals to be uploaded into these settings that have no backing or no corporate relationship. So you can think about individual YouTube channels and things like that, where it's independently produced, independently distributed, and there isn't really a tie to a major broadcaster. And so we have a range of information here, right? We have access to the most broad forms of cultural content that are produced for very large audiences across the globe. So things like movies, TV shows, etc. You also have access to this really niche content where it's just individuals uploading videos or uploading songs. And so we have this broad form of culture online with access to every component from the most popular to the least popular. And it's all equally accessible. And so this is very different from how communication has existed in the past and culture has existed in the past. We can think about push and pull media as a form of this. So push media are media where the creators are essentially sending messages out and they don't require a lot of effort from the receiver. So the person who's receiving the messages, you don't have to do much in a push media context, right? We can think about, okay, if I turn my television on and I'm tuned to a cable station, that's basically all the input that's needed from me. And then whatever content they send my way, I'm just going to receive it. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to use any kind of means to pull the next piece of content. It's just, it's being pushed out towards me constantly. So that's push media. The other form of media that we often think about are pull media. These are media where the receivers really have to seek the messages out. It's not just delivered to them, and it requires significant more effort from the receiver. And so you can think about the internet as being this, right? If you go to YouTube, you can think about YouTube as being really kind of a pull format, right? It's not like tuning into a television station. Rather, when you go to YouTube, you have to tell it what you want to see, and you have to look through, maybe their recommendations or something that they're pushing to you. But it's also giving you the capability to pull whatever you want from it. And so you can watch movies on YouTube, you can rent them there. There are free ones that have been uploaded. You can look up, videos that you might want to see. You can look up music artists. You can look up essentially anything. But the key here is that the internet and things like this are a form of pull media. And so we've got this big difference between push and pull that will be important for understanding how individuals seek out culture. And so the internet, like I said before, provides access to all culture. It's not just popular culture. Um, we can find those messages that are incredibly popular, those songs that are, incredibly popular, the Billie Eilish releases type things. But we can also find independent artists, independent things. And so this is very, very different from things that have gone on in the past. And so we'll talk about an example of what that looks like from the past. So if we think about just one aspect of popular culture, which is music and music videos, we can think about how someone might have gotten access to this type of information in the past. So, um, before the internet, if you wanted to listen to music, you had a couple of sources that you could go to, right? If you had cable TV, you could watch MTV. If you have a radio, you could listen to the radio. Or if you have a library of CDs or albums or cassette tapes, you could go listen to things that you have bought in the past. But what if you wanted to look for new music? If you wanted to find a new song, what you could do is you could listen to the radio, but the radio, 20 years ago was very similar to the radio today. Um, you play a lot of the same songs, you hear a lot of the same songs over and over and over again, and you might not get as much access to less popular music there because the radio is trying to produce content that lots of people will listen to. You could turn on MTV, but again, you're going to be seeing a lot of the same videos over and over and over again. Or you could go to the record store, but again, the record store is trying to make a profit, so they're not going to have that much niche content, and they're going to have content that appeals to a broad range of people. And so it might be difficult to find niche content or content that you hadn't heard before in those settings. We can think about how would you find music today? Well, today you have access to tons of music, right? You have access to all the YouTube channels, like every record label has a YouTube channel. Even small independent labels have YouTube channels. You can go there and you can find all sorts of content, and you can find bands that are just starting out. You can find bands that are more established. You can find like really underground music that you would never hear on the radio, even if you listen to every station of all time. You'd never hear it played there. You have streaming services that you can use in the same type of way. And so we have, a consciousness of, what are the most popular songs right now that are reflected in like award shows like the Grammys and things like that. But the internet also provides us access to all of this independent content and all of this new form of content that we just never have been able to access before. So um, it's cheap, it's easy, it's fast, it's all there. You can find almost anything you would want to on the internet. Um, and the music that you could find, right, you can really expand your taste if you're so inclined because of the access to it, right? When I was in college, my first year was 2001. There was no YouTube at the time. If I wanted to find independent artists, I would look and see who's playing in town, who's coming to the local places to play. I could go to an independent record store and talk to the people there, but it was a very difficult process. A lot of things that you would have to do that. Today, a lot of the music I discover, I'm simply searching online for record labels that I've liked previous artists from, and just listening to new things that it's easy. It's just a click of the mouse. So a big difference in how the internet has changed access to culture. So that brings us to the current study. And so the current study looked at these kinds of questions. How does the offline world and the online world interact to allow people to search for and find popular culture? So there were two research questions from the study. The first research question was, what is the relationship between the characteristics of the web and the types of cultural information that people seek online? And the second one was, how do interpersonal ties interact with the web to influence the types of information that people seek online? So these questions were really related to, are people even searching for culture online? Um, it seems like they probably are, but even if we have a hypothesis or an idea in research, it's always important to demonstrate that because that can open up new questions because maybe it doesn't come out exactly the way you think. So that first question is really looking at just kind of validating an assumption that we probably all have that, yeah, people use the internet to find cultural information. The second question relates to how does this interpersonal world or these interpersonal relationships that we have offline, how do they relate to cultural information that we seek out online? So the findings that they had here were that interpersonal ties and recommendations seem to really drive online culture seeking. So when we go online to search out culture, a lot of times we're bringing with us information from the offline world to find it online. And I'm sure you have all experienced this where you might be talking to a friend and they might say, have you seen that new viral video? Or have you heard this new song? Or have you seen this story on Twitter? Have you seen this meme? Right? A lot of the things that we will discover, right, might come from offline recommendations where we're told information from someone. And so those offline recommendations might drive our behavior in the online world. And so this is the same thing as any kind of recommendation, right? Like you need to try this restaurant, you need to listen to this music, you need to watch this movie. A lot of those recommendations are coming from our interpersonal relationships. Um, However, at the same time, even though people are searching out information online and sometimes they're being driven there by their offline relationships, When we get onto the online landscape, the vast quantity of information that we encounter, right, the number and just the sheer magnitude of information that's out there can make it feel like an overwhelming place, right? It's hard to find music that we want to listen to or movies that we want to see or things that we like because it's just so much there that it's difficult to weed it out or to filter out the information that we don't want to see or that we don't want to listen to. And so this feeling of being overwhelmed might explain why more people don't get online and find these independent artists and this independent music. It is kind of an overwhelming experience. The sheer number of options that are provided to us can make us feel like, we're searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. Lastly, one of the findings that they came away with was this idea that maybe the online world has created this kind of three-step flow process. And so the two-step flow process says that mass media feeds information to opinion leaders, and then those opinion leaders distribute that information to other people and or basically followers as being the idea there. This three-step flow says there's another step that's added on back at the end of this, that once the followers receive information, they then go back into the mass media to find it themselves. So this is a new process. It wasn't something that used to exist, right? So when the two-step flow model was originally uh, come up with, when they came up with this model, they were really coming up with it in a world where the mass media's broadcasts and messages were not repeatedly accessible. Once that broadcast was over, there was no way to record it, there was no way to re-access it. It was done. And so information flowed from the mass media to opinion leaders and then to individuals, and there wasn't this opportunity for the individuals to go back to the mass media. With the internet and the ability of this pull medium that we were just talking about in the earlier portions of this lecture, with this pull medium, we are now able to go back and seek out that information that we have been given by the opinion leaders. So it presents this kind of bookend to this model. And so maybe it's not just a two-step flow anymore. Maybe it's a multiple step or a three-step flow of information. So the conclusion of this article is that, we have access to large quantities of information, and just by having this, though, doesn't diminish the role of opinion leaders or the two-step flow. In fact, that's still operating um, in almost all cases. And so what we're seeing is a reinforcement of the two-step flow, if anything, not necessarily a refutation of it. So hopefully this lecture was useful. Hopefully it helped you go through this idea. This article at this point is getting a little old. It's over a decade old at this point. And so there are new questions that come up that we haven't seen yet. And so questions like, what is the role of recommendations online at this point, right? So not all recommendations are coming from offline. You're also getting recommendations from corporations and from algorithms and from all sorts of things, right? So when you go into YouTube, it's not like you have to search out any video. They're giving you a lot of things like you might like this trending right now, based on your previous viewing history. This is something that you should watch. And so we're seeing this kind of additional push mechanism happening in these pull media environments. And it's not necessarily related to a two-step flow. It's kind of related to a reinforcing spiral within the media. So a lot of interesting topics that might could be followed up on this. But hopefully this gave you a little bit of a better understanding of this reading and what they were looking at.